So what are these final goods and services that we're producing, and why do we care? The big thing we use GDP for is as a proxy for wealth. It's a variable that we can track basically objectively, right? It's a statistical thing. We don't literally see everything being produced and capture that and send it off to the Bureau of Economic Affairs to publish the GDP figures. We conduct surveys and get an estimate of how much people are producing within different parts of the economy, and we use that as our estimate for how wealthy we are. Now, production is certainly going to be important. You can't be wealthy if you can't make something. But our productivity isn't fundamentally what we care about. What we are really interested in as economists is our human flourishing. Wealth, what we want from wealth is the ability to flourish. What we can measure is not really even wealth, it's the physical stuff that we can produce, and specifically the market value of that stuff. So actually, before I get too far, let me just come back to this point of what GDP is. It's the market value, which means the price times the quantity of all the units being bought and sold within the relevant markets. So if we think about the market for beer, if we spend $10 per six pack and we buy 1,000,000 six packs, we've got $10 million of GDP. That has been produced. That's a really clever way to try and ask how much is being produced in the beer industry. If we compare that to some other industry, we can make a comparison in dollar terms, right? So you say compare the beer industry to the whiskey industry. The whiskey industry should be producing a smaller volume of product because it is a more alcoholic product. But if whiskey sells for a higher price per ounce, we might have comparable contributions to GDP from both of these two industries. Long story short, this is something that we can observe. We can see money changing hands, and we can see how many times that exchange happens. We can't see how much are people flourishing. We care about that, but we can observe this. There's an old joke. A drunk is wandering around under a lamppost late one night looking for his keys. Police officer comes up. He says, "Sir, can I help you?" And he says, "Yeah, I'm looking for my keys." And so they start searching around under this lamppost. And after a while, the police officer says, "Hey, where'd you lose the keys? Did you lose them here?" He said, "No, I lost them way over there." He said, "Well, why aren't we looking over there?" And the drunk says, "Well, the light's better here." And this is what we're doing as economists. We're going to where the light is. We can see things when we look at money changing hands, even though what we fundamentally care about isn't the same. So we've kind of got an assumption underlying how good this variable is. We're assuming that people behave sort of in similar, let's say, ratios of their attention. If I spend a third of my attention on what I'm doing in markets, and a third of my attention to what I'm doing at home, and then the other third of the 24 hours I'm asleep. So if I'm spending, let's say, of my waking hours, half my time in the market, half my time out of the market, and that's similar for lots of people, then GDP is going to allow us to make comparisons between, say, the country of Factoria and Smilania. What we care about, though, is not are we making lots of stuff, but is that stuff allowing us to get what we want out of our lives? Now, the good news is GDP tends to be a pretty good figure for estimating this. Countries with higher real GDP per capita have longer lifespans. People have access to more stuff, to nicer stuff, to more leisure time, which means more time with your family, to better healthcare, to all kinds of different things. For all the problems we've got, we are getting better. We are increasing how productive we are, and that means we're living better lives. Now, let's talk about the breakdown of GDP. This famous identity equation, GDP equals C plus I plus G plus net exports. I'm going to go from right to left because stuff is a little bit funnier down here and a little bit more obvious down at this end. So when we talk about net exports, again, we're talking about what do we produce, not what do we get. We produce the stuff we make for our neighbors. right? So exports count towards our productivity. Even though it's not stuff we get to enjoy, we made it for someone else. The stuff that they make for us, that is stuff that we get to enjoy, but we're subtracting that out of GDP because we're asking, what do we produce? What's produced here? The book is going to discuss the difference between gross domestic and gross national product. Don't worry too much about that here. The point is, we've got some measurement of how much do we make. We want to count what we make even if we don't get to enjoy it. And we want to take away the stuff that might fall into these categories, but that someone else made for us. So if you get a BMW, I guess we make BMWs here now, but let's pretend you get an imported car. That is a good thing. That means you are living a better life than otherwise, right? You chose to buy that car because you thought it was better than all your available alternatives. So if you get an imported thing, that is a good thing. That is contributing to your view of your life. It's not up to me to tell you which car is best, but if the one you think is best is an import, that import means that you are living a wealthier life by your own view. But it doesn't mean that we're producing them. So that's net exports. We're asking, what do we make? And we're going to take away things that we consume, like that BMW you imported, that we didn't actually produce here. And that Cadillac we sold to someone in Germany, even though we didn't get to enjoy it, we did produce it. So it's not something we're consuming, but we're going to count it to our production score. All right, net exports. We can kind of push that aside because in the US, our trade sector is small compared to our overall economy. We are an enormous country, so there's a lot of trade going on from New York to California that's sort of functionally equivalent to trade between, say, Spain and Poland. Within the EU, they're different countries. It counts as exports and imports for them, but exporting and importing between New York and California, same difference. Really, it's just a question of, does it let us get more of these things, right? So net exports, it sort of boils down to technical definitions. I care more about the big picture stuff. Now, the weirdest thing in the big picture is government spending. Now, government does a lot of things, and some of them are good and some of them are bad. So, well, and more importantly, there's not a market for these things. So some things the government does, there is a market, right? The USPS, there is a literal market for mailing things around. We can compare their prices to FedEx, we can make adjustments as necessary, but for something like having courts, well, there's no market for the Supreme Court. So how do we count the Supreme Court towards productivity? They are producing something. The only way we have to count it in a relatively simple and objective way is just to ask, how much money do we spend? So government spending, we are really asking about dollars because we don't have this supply and demand analog. Now for these things where we can ask about how much money changes hands on the market, it's not really giving us what we want, which would be total surplus. This blue triangle is what we want. This red rectangle is what we get. But if we compare one industry to a much larger industry that's selling a more marginal, more valuable product on the margin, higher marginal benefit product to more people, compare that to a smaller market, well, this one's going to count more towards GDP. And probably its total surplus is going to be proportionately bigger than the total surplus for this smaller market. So GDP, it's a really clever way to try and get at the size of this blue rectangle in a way that we can replicate, where we can make good comparisons between, say, different states or different points in time. But we are fundamentally getting something different than what we care about, right? It might be like, if you want to know how much does an elephant weigh, but you don't have a bathroom scale your elephant can fit on, you might settle for taking a measurement of how tall is it. Taller elephants are bigger. You would say 3 elephants here that are taller than the 3 elephants there weigh more, right? You've got a useful comparison, even though you're getting the proxy and not the latent variable that you care about, the underlying thing that really matters. So Government, we're getting even weirder than that because the government does some things that provide an enormous amount of value and some things that really destroy a lot of value. So the Supreme Court, it would be really difficult to even think about how you would put a price on that. Versus patently wasteful government spending, I'm sure that we all have our own favorite examples, and I'm sure we all disagree about each other's examples. But certainly we can all agree that there are things the government spends money on that is a waste. They build bridges to nowhere. No one else in the economy is able to do that because everyone else in the economy has to spend their own money. But we'll talk about that when we get to the economics of politics. So government, we're just asking about the money going in. We take some taxes, we spend it on the police, that counts directly towards GDP. If we build a bridge to nowhere, that counts towards GDP. If we pay the Supreme Court and their fees, and that amounts to $10 million, $10 million towards the Supreme Court is a big underestimate of what they're producing. But we don't have a market for the Supreme Court, so we don't have a market value for the goods produced in the year. So, government, we're looking just at the money. With consumption and investment, because we're looking at the money in a market setting, we're at least getting closer to the question of how valuable is this stuff that we are producing. Investment is when we're producing in what we would call capital goods. And this means basically things we use to make other things. So the way that the economy grows over time, the way we get a higher GDP is not that we make stuff and we eat it, which is consumption. We produce beer and that's it. Or we have a post office or we have a legal system or whatever. None of that means anything unless we're also building factories or robots or investing in knowledge, which is a form of capital inside your head, human capital. That knowledge is an investment good, right? We need to invest in order to be more productive in the future so that we can consume more in the future, which is what we ultimately really care about. So we'll tell stories about a trade-off between investment and consumption and moving to different parts of the PPF with respect to that. I'm sure you can fill in the blanks, but we'll get to that later. Gross domestic product, consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Investment is spending on final goods, so things that are going to a place that aren't going to be converted into something else, that are going to help us to make more things in the future. And then consumption, these are the things that we want. They might be consumer durables, like a refrigerator that's going to last you a long time. They might be things like a beer that you're going to drink this weekend. There are a lot of different things that count under consumption, and there are a lot of funny little distinctions between what counts here and what counts there. These are all sort of accounting specifics that have more to do with keeping this number comparable across different places than trying to get us closer to the answer of how do we improve our well-being. All right, let's stop here for now.